Okay, welcome everyone to our Environmental Justice Brown Bag Seminar today. We'll get started here in a minute. All right, so my name is Jessica Rudnick. I'm a Sea Grant Social Science Extension Specialist based in the Delta. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first of a 4-part Brown Bag Seminar series focusing on environmental justice. We're extremely happy to be hosting this as a collaborative effort between the Delta Science Program and California Sea Grant, and are looking forward to an excellent talk today from our two fantastic speakers. And I'll hand it over to Karen Gutierrez in a moment just to introduce our speakers. But first, I wanted to share a little bit of background on this series. So our Environmental Justice Brown Bag series will be 4 talks occurring over the next 3 months this fall, and are intended to cover more and bring more attention towards social and environmental justice issues and those issues relating to the Delta. This is an effort as the Delta Stewardship Council begins on a new environmental justice initiative. And we're hoping that by bringing leaders from environmental justice scholarship and public policy in to share more about their work and ideas, we can really sort of feed that conversation and inspire some of the work that goes into more environmental justice work in the Delta. So after today's talk, we have an additional 3 seminars planned through November and December. The details are here on the slide, and you should also get a registration link in follow-up to registering today. A couple of housekeeping logistics. There is both a chat function, which will be seen by everyone in attendance and the panelists, and a Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We will hold all questions until the end of the speakers' presentations, and then ask that you please use the chat or Q&A function to share your questions, and we'll use the remaining time after the talk for the presenters to answer questions. We expect that everyone please use the chat function respectfully and stay on topic, of course. And with that, I will hand it over to Karen to introduce our 2 speakers today. Thanks for being here.
Hey. Thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Gutierrez, and I am the 2021 California Sea Grant Fellow at the Science Communication Synthesis and Decision Support Unit at the Delta Science Program. So today, I just want to give a really brief intro to both of our speakers. So we are joined by Laurel Firestone, who was appointed to the State Water Resources Control Board by Governor Gavin Newsom in February 2019. Prior to joining the Water Board, Laurel, from 2006 to 2019, she co-founded and co-directed the Community Water Center, a statewide nonprofit environmental justice org based in California's Central Valley and Central Coast. Her career has focused on ensuring all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, and building increased diversity, equity, and inclusivity into water decision-making. Laurel holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a BA in Magna Cum Laude in Environmental Studies from Brown University. Our second speaker is Kristen Dobbin, and she is a new postdoc at UCLA in the Luskin Center for Innovation. She recently completed her PhD from UC Davis in the graduate group in ecology, where she focused her time studying the role for governance in creating, perpetuating, and solving drinking water disparities in California. For her dissertation research, Kristen evaluated challenges and opportunities associated with California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act for environmental justice and the human right to water. Prior to completing her graduate degree at UC Davis, Kristen served as Regional Water Management Coordinator at Community Water Center in Visalia, and she has a VA in Environmental Analysis from Pitzer College. So now with that in mind, I'll send it over to our 2 speakers.
Great. All right, well, thank you for having us here today, and for all of you for taking time to join us today. This topic is really a lifelong passion of both Kristen and mine, so we are always really excited to be able to talk with folks about really what we see as one of a few defining issues of our time around water. Today, we are going to try to give an overview of our understanding of water justice, environmental justice, and then dive directly into human right to water in California, the current context, and some of the local, regional, and state responses that we're working to implement here in the state. And then we're ending with some foundational takeaways to work for water justice that we want to leave you all with, and then hoping we can leave time to open it up to your questions. Next slide. So you may have heard the saying that in California, water flows towards power and money, or money and power. I would say that in California, water is power. Water really helps shape every aspect of our lives. It is really intimate. We bring it into our homes and into our bodies, and it nourishes everyone we love. Access to water has been and continues to be one of the most powerful drivers in our ability to create wealth, build local economic development and housing, and grow food. And water can be incredibly destructive with floods, sea level rise, and water can be fun and soul lifting us up in joy and connecting us to the power and wonder of the natural world that we're a part of. So water, like property and wealth, is really a clear and concrete manifestation of our values in our society. The reality is that access to water, or lack thereof, reflects the same fundamental challenges we have in our state, like structural racism, climate change, wealth inequality. So I've really always seen water justice work as a concrete way to address these fundamental issues which otherwise can feel really abstract and overwhelming. Next slide.
So I'm going to pick up where Laurel left off to just frame a little bit, given that this is a speaker series in environmental justice. And as Laurel is describing, access to water is about a whole lot more than just water. And environmental justice provides the framework for naming and understanding those connections. So California as a state has defined environmental justice as the fair treatment of all people, races, cultures, and income with respect to development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And on the ground, we often hear communities and advocates talk about environmental justice in terms of rights, both the right to equal environmental protection, as well as the right to live, work, play, and pray in communities that are safe and healthy and thriving. Another way we talk about this sometimes is in the fair distribution of environmental burdens and benefits. And although it might be obvious to some, it's important to say that the ways the environment, be it water resources, climate, or the built environment, intersects with our social, political, and economic structures is infinite, which means environmental justice is an extremely expansive topic. So our focus here today on drinking water, and particularly the human right to water, is just a small sliver, not just of environmental justice, but a small sliver of water justice, which also includes important topics around indigenous sovereignty, access to recreation, and many more. And I say this both to kind of highlight our position as just one talk in a series that could honestly go on forever, but also to highlight Laurel and I think many people who do this work, the importance of seeing our work interconnected with all these other structural issues. So as Laurel described it, because water is so connected with our social and other environmental, social and like political and economic forces, it is both a way that we can tackle those forces through kind of a concrete path. And it is also important when we're doing that to understand that we are all interconnected. So those other movements are continually relevant to the work we do in environmental justice and water justice in California.
Great. So we all come to this work from our own experiences. So I wanted to, and I like to start with giving you a little bit of background on the experiences and work that have really shaped how I view the state's role in making a California for all within the water context, and have really shaped my role as a member of the California State Water Board. So when I first started my career as a young attorney, I moved to the San Joaquin Valley to provide legal services to address water challenges in rural, low-income, primarily farm worker communities. And that's where I met and first met and worked with Susana de Anda, who is an amazingly gifted organizer, who is now executive director of Community Water Center, as co-founder with me. Early on, one of the first calls we got was from a mother in the town of Ducor, whose water in her home and at her children's school was coming out brown and smelled like sewage. There's a picture of it there. The local water board not only provided no information on what was going on, but canceled all regular public meetings. And when they did finally hold a meeting, the leaders of the water system dismissed the community's concerns, saying that the brown water is just how it is here. It's fine for coffee, stop complaining. So we were able to partner with a group, and this group here of local moms and other folks from the community that were organizing and help provide some support into navigating this Byzantine structure of water governance, who to call to request oversight and accountability. So in the case of Ducor, it turns out that the water system's wells had become contaminated with nitrate. They drilled a new well that was deeper, and there they hit manganese and hydrogen sulfide. But after some investigation by the state, it was found that the real issue in this particular circumstance that was causing the water to be brown and smell like sewage was that the maintenance and operation of the system was improper. So they were not flushing and cleaning and chlorinating correctly. And fundamentally, no one was enforcing the need to do so. So this pattern really is not unique. I think all of us in different contexts have seen that sometimes our biggest challenges are about needing changes in how we do our job, how organizations and agencies are structured, how we invest in areas that have been ignored, disenfranchised, or disinvested in for decades, if not generations. And I like to highlight this because it was my first lesson that even really the most tangible and visible water challenges, like this brown water coming out of our tap, are fundamentally human challenges that can't just be solved through engineering. So today, as a state water board member, it's even more relevant to me that what we need to address our water challenges in the state are really human solutions, which require us, not just technology, to solve. And those human solutions require just as real investment, expertise, and focus. Next slide. So it's really this basic value that led to passage of the Human Right to Water Act here in California in 2012. This is really the first of its kind in the nation, and it was born out of relentless community advocacy from environmental justice communities and local leaders throughout the state. And the goal is really to challenge the state to affirm its recognition of this problem and the right to expect more. Next slide. So a lot of folks ask, okay, but what does the Human Right to Water Act actually mean or do? So for one, it declares it a policy of the state, which creates really new awareness and intentionality here in California. It really helps us accept that we aren't yet living up to this promise in our state, and that everyone has a right to expect better. It significantly directs state agencies like the State Water Board, like the Delta Stewardship Council, any state agency to consider how to promote the human right to water within all programs. So it's not a legal cause of action. You can't just sue to magically create and achieve the human right to water, but rather it's really the foundation to do the hard work of living up to this within the many ways that our state takes action, provides oversight, provides funding. So after establishing this foundation of the Human Right to Water Act, advocates and agencies and policymakers have to go through the much harder work of developing resources, tools, programs, et cetera, to achieve this. Next slide.
So as Laurel is describing, kind of the reality is that the Human Right to Water law passed in 2012 is a vision and provides some important tools and a path forward for implementing that vision, but it clearly does not do the hard work for us. Like that is the charge that it kind of really presents to each and every one of us as Californians, and particularly those of us who are working in public policy or water at any level. So California was prior to the passage of the Human Right to Water and continues to this day to exist in a state of drinking water crisis. And it's important to name it as a crisis, even though it is long-term. Progress has been made for the nearly at least 2 decades, if not longer, but there's also new challenges that arise that kind of can take us backwards, or at least can seem to take us backwards, although in many cases they might have existed already and we're just recognizing them. So according to State Water Resources Control Board data, as of July 15th, there were more than 850,000 Californians that lacked access to safe drinking water. That means a primary violation, a health-related violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that constitutes those residents served by 288 water systems, which are displayed on this map with the red stars. So you can see, while there are, of course, areas of concentration in the San Joaquin Valley and the Coachella Valley, the Salinas Valley, this really is a statewide issue. And of these systems, 65% are serving low-income, disadvantaged community and severely disadvantaged community households. The vast majority of these systems, and then finally, it's important to note that we have about 2 million residents on unregulated water systems of basically unknown water quality. These water systems, whether they're private domestic wells or state small systems serving a cluster of 5 or 6 households, are rarely, if ever, tested, but our state data on ambient water quality suggests kind of grave cause for concern about the quality of water that these 2 million individuals are also receiving. So it's important to kind of call out that we have really good research and have had for a long time that shows that these drinking water disparities are determined by race, class, and geographic factors. So for example, we know that arsenic and nitrate disproportionately impact low-income and Latino communities. Same thing goes for lead, which also disproportionately impacts African-American communities. And it's also important to note that no matter what scale you look at these distributions on, you can kind of find the same disparities. So if you're looking at public schools, for example, like Community Water Center did in a report in 2016, you find the same patterns. Of 1,688 public schools impacted by unsafe water, the vast majority were serving Latinx students, were serving socially economic disadvantaged students. So as always, we have to remember that, as Laurel mentioned, the human right to water is not just about water quality, although of course that's a very central component, but affordability is a key access as well. And when it comes to affordability, we have less research and reliable statistics across the state. And this is due in part because it is challenging to define and measure affordability. And it's also due in part to data constraints and privacy related to some of the data issues here that aren't as simple as kind of some of the water quality. Not that water quality is simple, but that doesn't mean we don't know anything about affordability in the state. We know that there are many residents, particularly in small water, served by small water systems, that are paying 10% of their monthly income, if not more, on drinking water alone, which is kind of astronomical costs if you compare that to what an average person, for me example, here in Sacramento is paying month to month. And so we see that affordability is very intersected with quality. It's the same small systems that most struggle to achieve safe drinking water, also most struggle to achieve affordable drinking water. And then of course, those systems that don't have safe drinking water, residents end up paying multiple times. They're paying their tap water bills, but they're also paying for replacement water. And then importantly, advocates also remind us that they're paying with their health on a daily basis through that exposure. But affordability is not just a small water system issue. Affordability impacts residents up and down the state in many of our largest urban areas as well. Residents who live in poverty in kind of throughout the state struggle to pay their water bills, even when across the water system they are served by, those water bills are somewhat reasonable. And so these two issues kind of within system inequality, which has to do with wealth inequality, as Laurel mentioned, as well as like geographic inequalities across the state between systems, are both fundamental challenges to achieving affordability. And I now kind of follow up everything I talk about in affordability with the little COVID caveat that affordability has been a huge challenge prior to COVID, and the COVID-19 crisis demonstrates how these environmental injustices are compounded by other social and environmental issues. So as Californians lost their income sources over the last 18 months, shut-off moratoriums have preserved people's access generally, but has resulted in mounting household and system level water debts. So the Pacific Institute and the Rural RCAC did a report recently that documents that these impacts are also uneven. So you're seeing a trend here. That while most systems across the state have had a small, experienced a small, if any, change in revenue, some water systems have lost 30% of their monthly and annual revenue during this period. And then similarly within systems, most Californians are able to pay their bills even in this time of economic crisis, but almost 10% of Californians are unable to pay their monthly utility bills in this time of economic crisis and have accumulated as much as $38 million in water-related debt. Lastly, kind of returning to the three components of the human right to water, safe and clean, affordable, and accessible, the adage that you don't know what you had until it's gone is really apt when we think about water access, which is something we didn't talk too much about until we started losing access around the state. And again, is an example of these intersecting challenges and these that kind of transcend not just water justice and environmental justice, but also social and political issues. So in our compounding droughts, we've seen so many people across our state lose access to water. And this has really exposed these disparate levels of vulnerability, disparate levels of water security across the state. Since we started keeping track, California has recorded more than 3,300 domestic well shortages. We've also seen many public water systems lose water supply. And it's important to note that we're not just seeing inequities in drought impacts, but we see these same patterns of inequities in the plans that we're working on to actually address the drought impacts. So this is both, we can't just think of this as a natural or environmental issue, but this is also a social issue, because as we move to plan as a state to implement water shortages plans, to implement groundwater sustainability planning, we actually see replications of these same disparities and lack of access to water or vulnerability to losing water kind of replicated in our own planning and our own solutions to the natural inequities. Well, not natural, but to the drought inequities we've seen. So I just want to provide a quick case of the community of Teviston, which you maybe have heard about in the news recently. Teviston is in Tulare County. And in early June, Teviston lost all access to water. Teviston was originally settled by Black Dust Bowl migrants in the 1930s, is now a predominantly Latino community with about 100 households. And they rely on a single groundwater well. And so on June 9th, when their well went down, those 100 households, roughly about 700 people, had no water coming out of their tap at all. And when I tell this story, it's always important to say, But this wasn't the first time this happened in Teviston. This happened in 2012, and this happened again in 2017. And every time the well has been rehabbed to kind of create a temporary fix and bring the water back online, which it has been now done in Teviston. So mid-July, their well kind of came back online, but it's not solving the underlying issue of this vulnerability to water shortage that Teviston has existed with, honestly, for well over since 2012, but certainly since 2012. And we can see this when we look at the groundwater monitoring happening in that area. So Teviston falls into a groundwater sustainability agency that has a monitoring well actually right next to the community. And for well over a year before their well failed this summer, that groundwater sustainability agency was reporting really drastic declines in groundwater in the region. And Teviston is just one example of many. You can look to Fairmead, you can look to Woodville, you can look to Fraser Park, but you can also look well beyond the Central Valley. And I think that's something we all are noticing in this kind of revised state of drought, is that these impacts are not just a San Joaquin Valley issue or a Central Valley issue, but certainly touch statewide.
And that brings us to really drilling into the Delta. So at the Water Board, we keep a list of every community water system that's consistently failing to meet safe drinking water standards. And we call this the Human Right to Water list. And in total, we tend to have about 300 communities on that list at any given time. And while every region of the state is unique, none are exempt from these challenges, and drinking water access in the Delta demonstrates these same disparities that we've been talking about. There are about 98 community water systems in the Bay Delta watershed that are consistently failing to meet safe drinking water standards already. And you can see that even in the legal Delta, there are at least 5 communities on this list. Next slide. We also conducted a first of its kind statewide needs assessment that evaluated 19 different risk indicators. So risk indicators around water quality, water accessibility, affordability, and what we call TMF, technical, managerial, financial capacity, to identify those systems that are really high risk of failing. So through that, we identified over 600 community water systems statewide. So that's on top of the 300 that are already failing. And these communities, again, can be found throughout the state. There are about 218 of these high-risk community systems that we identified in this first year of the needs assessment are located in the Bay Delta watershed. And there are pretty significant numbers in the legal Delta. So these at-risk systems are important because every time we're able to take a system off the Human Right to Water list of failing systems, we're seeing new ones come on. So we have to be prioritizing preventing systems from failing if we want to make any progress in the state. And even more fundamentally, this is needed to ensure residents don't have to wait to have an emergency in order to get prioritized for help. Next slide. So as Kristen mentioned, in addition, there are many communities, so areas with high density homes that are reliant on domestic wells, so don't have a centralized water system. And these are really our most vulnerable households, both to contamination, but also to drought and water supply failures. And this map, which we also developed, is an analysis of those areas with relatively high density of domestic wells or state small systems, which are, again, not highly regulated, and also assessing their high risk relative to water quality. So just based on contamination alone, we estimate that there's about 80,000 households on domestic wells that are at high risk of not having safe drinking water. We don't know the exact number because there is not comprehensive domestic well testing throughout the state. And this doesn't, on top of this, there's even more households that are at risk of water supply shortages. And in the last drought, and even continuing on today, we are seeing numerous households go dry. So again, this is true in the Delta watershed, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. I do feel like I need to give some shout out to the many other EJ issues in the Delta. As we already mentioned, implementing the human right to water needs to be understood as just one component of broader environmental justice struggles. That's certainly true in the Delta, where there are many water justice issues. I did feel like I needed to highlight just one of the other EJ water needs I've learned more about from local community leaders in the Delta just this summer, and that's harmful algal blooms. So as many of you know, we are just seeing huge increases in the occurrence of harmful algal blooms in the face of climate change, things like hotter, longer summers, drought, less water flow. And these harmful algal blooms can pose a health risk to people, including children and animals, harm aquatic ecosystems, limit the use of drinking water sources and recreational water bodies. They have toxins and odors. And this is really, in particular, especially dangerous for unhoused individuals who live near polluted waterways, which we've seen just a huge escalation in the scale of that crisis recently. And also to subsistence fishing households. And so all of you likely know that there's a really significant subsistence fishing population, primarily in low-income and communities of color in the Delta, many of whom eat fish from the Delta more than 4 times a week. And so health effects for people include skin rashes on contact, diarrhea and vomiting if contaminated, if ingested, harm to liver, kidneys, or nervous system if toxin levels are really high. So I wanted to give a shout out. These pictures are from a tour that Restore the Delta hosted in Stockton. And our first stop was on McLeod Lake, where we saw HABs forming. And there's pictures of some of the young local community leaders that are taking on monitoring directly in their own communities. And we're getting some training by state board and regional board staff so that they can test and monitor HABs and help us track it. I know there are certainly similar EJ issues throughout the Delta communities around public access to waterways, natural spaces, other water pollution impacting subsistence fishing and hunting, sea level rise, flooding, to name a few. So next, Kristen and I are going to outline some of the specific local, regional, and state responses and actions that we're seeing related to drinking water and the human right to water. But as we go through, we wanted to recognize that these are really broadly applicable responses and strategies to address other EJ issues, whether in the Delta or beyond.
Yeah, thanks, Laurel. So that, is a lot of gloom and doom, but it's also, right, like empowering, because we have to know where we are to know where we want to get to, and knowledge is power. So we did want to turn now to, some of the ways in which these kind of chronic and systemic challenges are being addressed, and focusing on kind of the broader themes that unite these responses, because quite honestly, there is way more happening at like local, regional, and state scale than we could summarize even in a day. But one of the kind of local responses that is really encouraging and exciting and really promising as we move forward and continuing to implement the human right to water is local partnerships. We have seen, we see across the state many examples of like local communities, households getting together, kind of with the knowledge that they are stronger together and that there's a lot of room and expertise and resources locally among various stakeholders. And one of the ways we see this happening across the state is through system consolidations, whether that's the actual physical integration of water systems into a more resilient kind of regional system that serves a broader population, or whether that's kind of sharing resources across systems that remain operated as individual units. One example of this is the Oxbow Marina Mutual Water Company. And like many consolidation stories, the Oxbow Marina Mutual Water Company found themselves out of compliance with arsenic. And they were no longer serving compliant, safe drinking water to the 100 households that the company had been serving, for many decades. And ultimately, the solution through local partnership was to combine the Oxbow Marina Mutual Water Company system with the Isleton water system, and bring the two systems into operation together. And with funding from the state and a lot of kind of infrastructure work, we know these projects are not cheap, but they are long-term investments in a sustainable solution that brings two communities, not just the Oxbow Marina being in a position where they now have compliant drinking water, but both communities kind of more resilient to climate change, more able to respond to changing conditions together. And so that project happened from 2015 to 2017. And the households previously served by the Oxbow Marina are now connected to the system of Isleton and receiving safe drinking water. And this kind of idea of partnerships is also applicable at the regional level. So we know that water is a shared resource. So individual households and community access is in many ways determined by watershed level activities, whether that's contamination, pumping, but also management and planning. And so increasingly as a state, we've been turning for this reason and many others towards integrated planning at the watershed level. And we're doing that through integrated regional water management. We're doing that through groundwater sustainability agencies and other water quality management entities and coalitions. And these are all opportunities to bring users throughout a kind of a shared watershed together to kind of plan and build sustainability collectively. And when we look at this from a drinking water perspective, this is an important cost-effective way to proactively avoid many of the issues that we then end up solving at the community level. And so we can think of it as basically drinking water source protection. And we have seen a lot of really promising examples from across the state of the ways that regional planning can bolster equitable water access, as well as regional sustainability, economic development, and what have you. But we also see similar cause for concerns that we can't expect that type of win-win solution if we don't have communities and all stakeholders at the table from the get-go. As I alluded to earlier with this question of perpetuating inequalities in our planning responses, we've seen that the possibility and kind of the opportunity of regional planning is an opportunity for source water protection. It also can go awry in kind of the wrong direction when we're not doing that thoughtfully and intentionally and integrating drinking water with other water uses. And kind of the key consideration that I think, or the multiple considerations that lie at the heart of these solutions at the local and regional level, is really these questions of community power and water decision making. And I think this goes all the way back to what Laurel started with, that these are human solutions and it takes us and investing in us. Ultimately, we are not engineering ourselves out of the California drinking water crisis. So fundamentally, all solutions start with creating a table, making decisions, and ultimately we need those tables and those decisions to be representative of all communities that are impacted by water management and water decision making. And those impacted by unsafe water really need to be at the forefront of leading the solutions in our state to address those challenges. And successful consolidations, for example, the Oxbow Marina consolidation with Isleton, require having willing partners that are engaged in what is likely years of negotiations and planning to build that type of local resilience. And the same thing goes for regionally. Regional planning that actually acts as source water protection for drinking water users requires that same type of leadership and collaboration and buy-in and collaboration at the regional level. And one thing I want to highlight is that there is a lot of research that kind of continues to come out that shows our water governance structures have a long way to go to realizing this vision of inclusivity and representation. So we've seen research from UC Davis and UCLA kind of demonstrate that people of color and women are kind of systematically underrepresented in drinking water decision-making. The same thing goes for looking at groundwater sustainability agencies, for example, or integrated regional water management groups, which have been heavily dominated by agricultural water agencies. But we also see at the same time a lot of programs and initiatives across the state that are changing that trend. So for example, Community Water Center has the Community Water Leaders Network, and Self-Help Enterprises has developed a Rural Communities Water Leadership Institute. And these different initiatives from around the state to empower community residents themselves to sit at these decision-making tables has resulted in kind of exactly that, leaders at the local, regional, and state level. And so I think Laurel and I both have examples of residents assuming positions, including in the Safer Advisory Board that I know Laurel is going to talk about in just a minute. So before I hand it over to Laurel, I guess the kind of sum up point of this is that this local power that enables the local and regional solutions that we need is also really tied to the state policy solutions that we need. And Laurel highlighted that at the beginning by emphasizing that the human right to water was only made possible by decades of committed organizing. And the same thing goes for the passage of the 2019 Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Program, which I'll hand it over to Laurel to talk about now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. The only reason that we have this program is really continued relentless advocacy by folks at the grassroots level. Perhaps what I think of as the biggest example of state level responses on how to work to achieve the human right to water in California and to really build equity and resilience in the face of climate change and these other compounding crises that are that exacerbate the crisis that we're already in, is our safe and affordable funding for equity and resilience, our Safer Drinking Water Program. So the goal of our program, this is at the State Water Board, is to provide safe drinking water in every California community for every Californian. The program was coined after passage of SB 200, Senate Bill 200, and it formalizes and integrates work which the Water Board had been doing for a long time, but through that integration and through an additional creation of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, we were able to utilize $130 million per year for 10 years towards drinking water projects, primarily in small disadvantaged communities. And that funding is intended to fill funding gaps and leverage and really provide a more direct link to much larger pots of infrastructure funding, which are exceeding $1 billion, but tend to pass by those communities that need it most. As part of that program, there's a few components. So we develop an annual needs assessment. I presented some maps that were focused on the Delta region watershed a few slides ago. And that is really looking at looking at systems that are already failing to provide safe drinking water access. Where are the systems at risk of failing? And where are the areas at high risk households on private wells that are at high risk of being contaminated. So helping to identify communities most impacted. We also set up and are working through our advisory group and through community engagement processes that are built in both to that and to local implementation processes that are guiding how we spend our money and how we are supporting our on-the-ground solutions. We have an annual fund expenditure plan that lays out priorities and it helps to target and prioritize how we're investing state funds. We're providing technical assistance providers to help communities develop projects, both to address immediate needs as well as build resiliency. And that is really critical for making sure that communities are able to get to the point of being ready to accept a larger infrastructure funding. And we are really, to much greater degree, proactively prioritizing communities with investments and technical assistance rather than waiting for them to come to us. And rather than supporting only those that are able to navigate our complex government funding processes. And we are really doubling down on both incentivizing consolidations and these sort of structural changes to shift this sort of fragmentation and segregation of communities into different small water systems. And we have new powers to actually mandate consolidations when that's the only feasible alternative. So by proactively identifying, prioritizing, engaging, and investing in communities that have been disinvested in for decades, we really see this as a model of how we can bring and sort of begin to dismantle the reality that race and income are predictors of access to safe water in our state. Next slide. So I wanted to leave you with some thoughts on how we can each bring equity into our work, no matter what level you're working on water. I think we first need to recognize that the reality is there is a very explicit history of racially motivated deprivation of essential infrastructure. So places like Ducor, which I talked about at the beginning, were explicitly targeted in the Tulare County General Plan to withhold basic infrastructure investment, like funding for water and sewer, for a period of over 30 years. That was explicitly in the plan among other communities that were targeted. There's also racial annexation, racially exclusive zoning, purposeful denial of funding and investment. So these are all very real dynamics that shape what our communities and community infrastructure look like today. So in order to begin to dismantle this structural racism, we have to intentionally bring equity into our goals and strategies within each of our actions and programs and projects, whether at the local, regional, or state level. So what does that mean? Brainstormed a few of the ways we can do that. I think starting with really examining and better understanding, intentionally looking at what are disproportionate impacts within our programs or actions, projects that otherwise we may not be seen. In order to do that, and also in order to develop approaches, really meaningfully engage, support, and transparently collaborate with impacted communities. So making sure that there are seats at the table and really authentically valuing community expertise. Proactively planning and preparing for emergencies with vulnerable communities, prioritizing investment in environmental justice and frontline communities to both address harm, also provide some of that resiliency, safety net, and building resilience for for climate change and what we know, will continue to be exacerbations of the challenges we see today. So we're hoping that some of the examples we talked through today have made those approaches more concrete. I think for all of us working in the water sector, we really need to bring this into the core of what we do. If we don't, certainly as state agencies, we are exacerbating or at best perpetuating these race and socioeconomic disparities. So we all really have an important part to play. It can't wait, it's urgent, it's real. And I'm really excited by each of you that took the time to join us today and are doing your own work and bringing your own leadership to this work. And with that, I think Kristen and I would be happy to answer any questions now or as follow-up, and we look forward to working with each of you into the future.
Thank you very much, Kristen and Laurel, for an excellent talk. A lot of ground covered there, figuratively and literally. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A already and a few in the chat as well. So I'll just start us off. We actually got 2 questions related to essentially how the Human Right to Water Act is implemented. So one question asks, does the act have teeth behind it, or is it a principle that rather agencies should consider and try to base their rulemaking on? And a related question that asks, it seems that the Water Board has brought the human right to water into the work that's being done, but have you seen examples of that happening in other agencies? And what are your thoughts as to why or why not?
Great. Okay, I'll take that. This is a really common question. Does the Human Right to Water Act have teeth? I think it's like anything. You can pass a law, you can adopt something, but what really matters is implementation. And so what we see, and I think how I see the Human Right to Water Act is that foundation on which we build really meaningful implementation. And the implementation is what matters. So, like anything, you can put something on paper and you could say it has more teeth than it does, than this one does. There's not, like, as I said, a cause of action where you can say, I'm going to sue somebody and I'll get, magically some outcome. The reality is that no matter what really matters is implementation. And so what we've seen with Human Right to Water is that it is that foundation. It does provide that intentionality and requirement on agencies to bring that into their actions, their decisions, their investments, and that's really where the rubber hits the road, as they say. Different agencies have done this in different ways and at different paces. I think because, the State Water Board oversees drinking water providers and provides the main drinking water funding in the state, we were the first ones that very clearly that had this as a focus and priority for action. But even that, it doesn't actually have teeth until we actually are adopting those guidelines for funding, are taking deliberate actions to make sure that we're doing that. So we talked about that today. I have seen other agencies. DWR is developing a process around this more. I think other agencies that aren't, again, the primary agency for funding and regulating drinking water, it's been more of a process for them to see what their roles are, but I think that's beginning to really accelerate.
Okay, great, thank you, Laurel. So I have another question in the chat. So somebody says, my understanding is that water agencies are constitutionally prohibited from providing lifeline water rates or subsidies to low-income residents. What is being done to rectify the situation?
Yeah, I think that's Prop 218. Our Constitution does have this restriction on local agencies only being able to charge the cost of service in their water rates. There are ways that local agencies can address equity within their water rates. A number of them are doing this through a couple strategies. One is lifeline rates for a basic amount of water. So they have a low cost for initial water and then have increasing tiers over time. Another is by being able to establish low-income assistance programs. Oftentimes the publicly owned agencies have been able to do this have some creative ways of using other sorts of funding. There's also just I think ways that water systems have been able to, and this is true of other government services, have been able to look at how they're defining water service and bringing payment plans, customer assistance programs into the overall cost of service. I think this is an area of high attention. We are providing a lot of money in debt forgiveness right now, or about to in the next month, that I think will is an example of hopefully what will become a statewide program where that can be funded over time. And I also just say this is really an issue for local agencies and that are publicly owned. It's not for the privately owned utilities are actually required to provide subsidized water rates for low-income residents. And there are bills going through. I think the latest one just got held for made a 2-year bill to really kind of unpack what we can be doing.
I was just gonna add, because I see another question in the chat that relates to Laurel's point, both about the human right to water requiring implementation and about kind of constraints, whether they're Prop 218 or others. And this is kind of where that leadership piece comes in, is that ultimately water provision is a majority local issue across the state. And this is where we do see local leaders taking the impetus to kind of act on the human right to water and embody that vision. And we also see local leaders being creative in how they work around barriers to accomplish that. And so I think that the question is kind of like, if the human right to water focuses on state agencies, and in its language it does, but I think that is our point about leadership and community power, is that we will never get to accomplishing the human right to water with just state agencies taking this on, because ultimately water provision is local, it's regional, and these questions of not shirking responsibility, but really accepting that we all have a role to play in implementing the human right to water. I don't think we're there yet, but that's where we need to go with some of those questions of kind of local and regional leadership.
Awesome. There are many more questions here. I'll give you one big one that maybe we can get a quick, pithy answer on before we close out. So it speaks to California's antiquated historic water rights system. And the comment says these are no longer viable in the 21st century. What are your thoughts on what we can do to revise or update the water rights system to center equity and justice?
I'll jump real quick and then Laura, I'll turn it over to you to end. I mean, I think the point is clear and increasingly obvious to everyone in the water sector. And just as an example of how this works, and Laurel highlighted, our water agencies, our public and private districts across the state, represent a history of systemic racism and discrimination. And when we go to implement different things, for example, a lot of my research centers on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that foundation replicates itself. And we have seen this kind of across the board in a lot of our programs. So that isn't an answer to what the solution is, but I think we have come a long way in recognizing that these root problems really do have to be addressed. Yeah, I don't have the solution, but I do think that we have a lot of examples across the water sector to show that this history of water development in the state is part of our problem and part of what we're grappling with day to day, and need to name kind of in a day-to-day way as well, as Laurel did earlier.
Yeah, top of mind, especially for us at the Water Board right now, as we're really leaning into having to implement the water rights system like never before in the face of drought with curtailments. It does seem to me, as new to the Water Board, as administrating the water rights, how much our system is built to fail, and how much we need to be looking at how to bring the system into, bring equity into the system, but also bring the ability to navigate this new reality with climate change, as we also look at how to address these kind of fundamental inequalities in our state.
Well, thank you again, both. Thank you so much for your talk today and for being the first of this series. So thanks to all who joined us. I hope you'll be able to make it for our subsequent seminars later this fall, and the recording from today's seminar will be posted on the Stewardship Council's website in the next week or so. So should be able to find it there and share it for anyone who isn't able to make it. So thank you all, and see you soon.